welcome to a discussion of the Syrian humanitarian crisis. We're going to talk this morning about the COVID-19 recovery and the next stage of the Syrian refugee response after 10 years. And we will also be launching a report this morning, which many of you received, and if not, we'll make sure you get it as part of this conversation. I'm Andrew Seeley, I'm president of the Migration Policy Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this conversation. We are entering the 10th year of the Syrian humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis that remains the largest refugee crisis in the world. It is a crisis that continues to call attention around the world, as it should, and we will see at the end of this month the Brussels conference, where international actors are also discussing their role and the co-responsibility in what remains the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. One of the things as we're getting into the 10th year to think about is long-term strategies on integration. One of the things we've learned from research around the world is that integration in host societies and the countries around Syria have been immensely generous in taking people in when they were fleeing from violence and war in Syria. But one of the things that is most beneficial, not only for refugees and migrants, but for host societies, is looking at integration, how people become full members of society, to what extent they can contribute fully to the labor markets, can be part of public services, and can be part of public life. And this plays out differently in different societies. Every society has to make its own decisions, but moving in that direction is something that benefits not only refugees and migrants, who clearly benefit, but also host societies. And so beginning that conversation, continuing that conversation, deepening that conversation is something that we want to do today. We've been very fortunate to work with DSP, of Durable Solutions Project, over the past year, almost a year actually, Kat, on about 9 or 10 months, looking at experiences from around the world that can may be useful in the context of host societies of the Syrian diaspora, Syrian refugees in the region. We've looked at examples from Europe and Africa, elsewhere in the Middle East, from Asia and from Latin America. And the report that you either have or will receive shortly is a report that really tries to draw on those experiences and try and look at what might be useful in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, called A Bridge to Firmer Ground, Learning from International Experiences to Support Pathways to Solutions in the Syrian Refugee Context, and a great honor for us to work with DSP on this. And I want to call out Camille Lacos, who from MPI was the person who led this effort, and Camille you'll hear from at the end, talking about this report. She worked with her colleagues, Sam Davidoff, Gore, Timo Schmidt, Susan Fratsky, Andrea Tanko, Belen Zanzucci, and Jessica Bolter, who all have put a lot of work into this over the past year, and I want to thank all of them for their work. Today we have a phenomenal panel from the region talking about what's going on. We want to spend most of our time talking about what's actually happening on the ground. We'll talk about the report at the end of this conversation today, and I will present the panelists in a moment. We really have 4 outstanding panelists that you're going to want to hear. But before that, my great honor to go to the director of DSP, to Catherine, to say a few words. So Catherine Achilles, lead us off in the conversation.
Thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon and good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this really important discussion today. The Durable Solutions Platform is an initiative of 6 INGOs, which is aimed at conducting research and stimulating policy dialogue on long-term solutions for displaced Syrians across the region. And we're really pleased to be partnering with the Migration Policy Institute on the research launch today and on this discussion panel. And really can't thank the MPI team enough for the amazing collaboration and on the report. Ahead of Brussels conference next week and its discussions on support to host countries, creative approaches to sustaining refugee self-reliance and bolstering the resilience of host communities and countries are really urgently needed. This includes learning lessons from our interventions to date, addressing the barriers to economic and social inclusion of refugees that we now face, as well as looking to other contexts that are grappling with similar challenges to see what we can learn from them. The conference, of course, comes at 2 really grim milestones. The first is 10 years of conflict and displacement from and inside Syria, and 1 year of the pandemic and its severe social and economic impacts globally. Countries in the region are now grappling with a complex series of challenges, with rising unemployment and poverty across the board, creating unprecedented pressures on hosting countries to shore up resilience and self-reliance of refugees and citizens alike. And so in many ways, I think we find ourselves again at a crossroads when it comes to the Syrian response. How will we rise to the challenges given the broader economic reality? And how can we ensure that there is coherence and integration of the broader recovery that needs to happen in the region and the refugee response to really ensure that nobody is left behind and to promote these longer term solutions for Syrians? These questions are really at the heart of DSP's work on host states and on our focus on supporting medium-term approaches to displacement. By focusing on medium-term approaches, we recognize that while durable solutions might be elusive right now, steps can be taken to promote the rights of displaced persons and vulnerable host communities to live safely, securely, and with dignity in displacement. And that enhanced resilience and self-reliance can contribute to the pursuit of the different durable solutions, and in doing so, enable people to realize their individual preferences and choices in the future as conditions change to allow them to do so. This really requires us to consistently learn and adapt to support people. Our work as DSP has looked at how cash assistance can play a role in supporting longer term outcomes in Lebanon, looked at effective social safety nets for vulnerable people in Jordan and Iraq, and examines the financial architecture in the region. And of course, together with MPI, learning lessons from other contexts to really revitalize discussions at this really critical juncture, both for DSP's work and for our broader community. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion today and the insights from our very esteemed panelists and the audience in taking this discussion forward, supporting and driving discussions at the Brussels conference next week in relation to these, and charting a renewed course for support to the refugee response in the countries that are hosting them. Thank you very much. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Catherine. That was fabulous. And thank you for everything you do at Durable Solutions Platform. Extraordinary effort. And for us, it's been a great partnership working with you over the past few months and benefiting from your network and expertise as we thought what could be relevant in the global experiences that we wanted to bring to the table. And we really appreciate that and everything you do. Let me turn to a phenomenal panel that we have today. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to go straight into the conversation. Hasan Jannati is the executive director of Busla, a CSO in Turkey, aimed at building knowledge and skills for Syrians to rebuild their communities. He's an experienced trainer, program manager, and capacity builder, and has consulted for multiple UN agencies and INGOs. Sally Abi Khalil is the country director of Oxfam Lebanon, the first Lebanese woman to run a major international NGO within the Syrian response in Lebanon. She's worked extensively on humanitarian and development issues in the Middle East over the past 2 decades, including as the chair of the Lebanon Humanitarian INGO Forum. At Oxfam, she's led humanitarian response programming, social innovation, entrepreneurship initiatives for youth and women, promoting the right to work, establishing civil society networks, and promoting feminist approaches towards leadership and collective action. Welcome, Sally. Professor Zaid Ayadat is the director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the University of Jordan and a professor of political science at the Prince Al Hussein School of International Studies. His research, as you know, focuses on human rights, conflict management and resolution, the democratization of politics in the Middle East, and Islamic politics. He's worked with the Royal Hashemite Court in Jordan, as well as numerous non-government institutions, and is chair of the board of Arab Renaissance for Development and Democracy. Welcome. And at the end, I'll introduce again Camille Lacoste, who is policy analyst at MPI and MPI Europe, and she'll say some words about the research we've been working on. But great to have all of you here, and looking forward to this very intense conversation. And so with that, let's turn to the conversation. Let's start with the immediate, which is, what has the impact of the pandemic been on refugees, on host communities, and host countries? And let me turn to Hasan and Sally to start this conversation. Hasan, why don't you start us off?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you, DSP and MPI, for hosting us in this interesting webinar. As you know, today we discuss a controversial issue that has affected on the global level, and the refugees were severely impacted besides the host community. COVID-19 has affected Syrian refugees in different aspects and at the same time in different sectors, not only in livelihood, in education, in health, and also we have to take in our consideration the funding allocated for Syrian refugees already has been split between COVID-19 response and existing projects. If we mention how is affected, we have seen a lot of Syrian refugees lost their job because of the COVID-19. And also we noticed A lot of Syrian refugees have been taken on unpaid leave. Sure, the host community also they suffered, but maybe in less percentage. Also, I can mention, according to some statistics, more than 70% of Syrian refugees they cannot access to some services, and also as refugees had many needs unmet even before pandemic. Always, as you know, we have a question around access to the labor market, which were often challenging. And now, as a result of increased unemployment, unfortunately, tension with host community may become more difficult to manage. Uh, Besides, refugees sometimes are perceived as competing with nationals for jobs. At the same time, this it leads to increase refugees percentage in the informal sector, where abuse is more common, face low pay, long working hours, and bad working conditions. Also, it's very important to mention, according to statistics, more than 90% of Syrian companies, their business and operation strategies in 2020 affected negatively as a result of the COVID crisis. Last but not the least, it's very important also to take in our consideration COVID-19 response was managed by Turkish NGOs and INGOs and a few Syrian organizations, but access to the needy refugee families was taking into account only Syrian refugees, and we don't integrate in our projects refugees who came from Yemen or Egypt or Iraq, and this is considered as gap in this point. Over from me, Mr. Andrew.
Thank you, Hassan. Appreciate that. Sally, how are you seeing this in Lebanon?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation to be on this esteemed panel. I'm quite honored. It's very difficult to speak about the COVID-19 pandemic in Lebanon without touching upon the myriad of crises that the country is currently facing. So Lebanon's facing a multitude of crises right now. We have, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, like everywhere else in the world, but we also have an economic and financial collapse and meltdown that is taking place in real time that started in October 2019. We have political instability, and we have the aftermath of the August 2020 Beirut blast. And so all of this paints quite a bleak picture, a picture of desperation, to be honest, to all communities across Lebanon. I mean, I'm here sort of frazzled today, given the situation in the country that's unfolded in the last 48 hours, and I can touch upon that a bit later. But I'm speaking from a position of privilege. So imagine the vulnerable communities, especially Syrian refugee communities, that are currently experiencing the devastation of this economic fallout, the massive explosion, and the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. Just to give you a few points to paint this picture. Inflation in Lebanon is currently at 400%. We're seeing a 400% increase in food prices and goods, and this is rising every day. In Oxfam surveys to refugees, we're seeing that the assistance that they're getting in their income, should they even be lucky enough to be working, is not enough even to cover their basic needs. The COVID-19 pandemic has made everything much worse, both to host communities, but specifically to refugees. Only 2% of surveyed people during the lockdown in January 2020 are still working, 2%. 81% of households who were surveyed could not even purchase enough to see them through this lockdown. And this is mainly due to not having enough income. The latest vulnerability assessment of refugees that UNHCR conducts on a yearly basis shows that 89% of Syrian refugees are currently living in extreme poverty. And this is a stark deterioration compared to last year's estimate of around 55%.
This is all coupled with economic insecurity and the continued deterioration of the living conditions in the country. And of course, the not so secret narrative of the Lebanese government and the ruling elites of sort of their pro-return and anti-integration, or one can say anti-refugee policies over the last few years. We're also seeing that, when it comes to COVID-19 specifically, that there's real stigmatization or actual fear of stigmatization among refugees that is quite alarming. There's high positivity and death rates among Syrian refugees, but the majority do not have access to testing. And even when these testing fees are covered, accessing testing centers is just not worth, for example, the risks of arrest that refugees may face, given that a majority of them do not have legal residence. So the stigma of contacting the virus is very real. And this fear is genuine amongst the refugee population, fearing isolation, arrest, contracting the virus itself, not being able to work or accessing their basic needs, being harassed, or even worse, being deported or forced to return. We're seeing, of course, within this very dire situation, an increased dependence on aid, specifically for Syrian refugees, but now we're also seeing it to the Lebanese host communities, where we've also seen that poverty in Lebanon is now over 55%. These are figures from last year, so they're much worse now, and unemployment at over 30% in the country. So a very, very, depressing situation to say the least. Over.
That is really quite dire. Thank you for sharing that. As we look forward, Professor Zaid Ayadat, tell us, how can Jordan priorities include refugees? How can the Syrian population be incorporated into recovery processes? And what should the priorities be for the country going forward? How do you see this playing out?
Well, thank you, Andrew, and I'm really delighted to be part of this panel, and this is a great discussion and timely needed when indeed. Well, question, what priority should be? Maybe only gods know. I don't know how we're going to do it, but let me bring another thing to the context of the refugees issue at large before I start talking about priorities and incorporating and integrating refugees in Jordan. Well, look, at the global level, I can see this global South divide and the global South suffering from this movements of people, migration and refugees. And according to numbers, of course, 85% of the refugees and migrants are in the South, from the South to the South, in the South. While the discourse in terms of refugees issues and migration and the rules of the game are produced in the global North. And that takes me to the kind of the mindset and the mentality that we've been dealing with these issues since ever, especially the Syrian ones. So if we go back, this is the 10th anniversary of the crisis in Syria. And the mindset has been very simple. Containment is a Cold War. And here I'm bringing my political science hat to this. It's just keep them away, keep them ashore, unfortunately. And, we do whatever. So host communities should integrate refugees within them, regardless of any political burdens on the local communities and host communities. That I'm not advocating myself, but this is the reality it is. While, United States and Trump admitting, I don't know how many refugees for that reason. Now, the combination of the Syrian refugees crisis with the rise of Daesh and the radicalization and violent extremism, and also populism, it's the entire picture, mindset, mentality of dealing with the issue is dangerous. And it's not humanitarian. So we need to keep the risk away. And that just contributed to the alarming issue of the refugee crisis, of the Syrian refugee crisis in the region as well. Leave alone, of course, using the refugees themselves as a card for political bargaining and strategic dialogue between bigger players in the region. And this is very clear, it speaks for itself. Now, that aside, we see the COVID-19 been impacting people across the globe in uneven way. and only deepening the inequalities and hitting the poor and the weak in the societies. And all data shows that. And refugees everywhere, including, poor, including women, including youth, are more subject to the suffering of either the pandemic in terms of health or the consequences of it in terms of integration or economic situation. And the Syrian refugees in Jordan is no exception of that, unfortunately, despite all what had been done in Jordan to somewhat accommodate their needs and trying to support and help integrating them and minimizing their suffering, if you wish. Now, but if you want to ask me about the priority needs to be done for the recovery plans in Jordan, whereby the refugees, Syrian refugees, be part of the plan itself and also integrated in future activities executing that plan, I think the most important thing should be a comprehensive and continuous impact and need assessment of both the host and refugees communities, which we're lacking. And it is, it's like a crisis management mentality again, just hit a run, ad hoc. It's not a systematic assessment needs for the host and refugees communities. So a good understanding of the most impacted segments, who, how, and how much, as well as success, is key for targeted evidence-based policy for recovery, and also incorporating and integrating the Syrian refugees into the planning. I just want to cite very quick, in one study during the early stages of the pandemic in Jordan, 1/3 of the Syrian workers had lost their jobs permanently due to the crisis, compared to only 17% of Jordanians. This is just to prove what I've been saying about uneven impact of the pandemic on the segments of societies. Prior to the lockdown in Jordan, the average monthly income during the past 12 months had been 368 Jordanian dinars, while the average income in March, this 2020, was reduced to 215 dinars. This decline, of course, is much more bigger when it comes to the minimum age paid for the Syrian workers. And other examples, like 60% of the workers express that cash support to families who have lost their source of income was an important measure to minimize the adverse impact of this crisis. So cash, what if we're going to prioritize? So the cash support is important element of any recovery plan. So this could be one way to prioritize. The other one would be building an inclusive database of the people, of all people's demographics, particularly those working on the informal sector, living in the marginalization, migrants and refugees. And then inclusion of refugees and migrants in the overall response to the pandemic and post-pandemic consequences, as together they constitute, these refugees, 30% of Jordanians' population. So we're not talking about, just a known number. 30% of Jordan populations are refugees, and they have to have a say in any recovery plan that Jordan's planning for the future. We should also, in an exercise that we've done here at CSS, Center for Strategic Studies, forecasting the macroeconomic recovery for the country, here are some of the scenarios. During the third quarter of 2020, the economy contracted by, as we all know now, minus 2.2%, compared to positive growth of 1.9% in 2019. And that marks the worst economic downturn in Jordan since 1993. And I'm bringing this number for you to expect and to predict and to foresee what futures the Syrian refugees in Jordan are awaiting because of this downturn in Jordan's economy. The unemployment rate rose to 23.9, almost 25% recently. The numbers are not out yet. This is very alarming. And if you add to that the increasing of the poverty, people who are living under poverty lines in Jordan, this is then the socially threatening indicators in Jordan impacting both Jordanian and Syrian. So any priority should be dealing with this unemployment and poverty as well, without, of course, excluding the refugees out of them. There are a lot of things maybe I share with you later on, not to waste your time talking about the scenarios, but the other priority should be strengthening the capacity of the healthcare system. Probably some of you have been following what had happened last Saturday when we lost 7 Jordanians because of the lack of the oxygen at the Salt Hospital. And this just tells you about the infrastructure of healthcare system, the personnel, the training, and the value system, the commitment to the serving to the others, which is a very important issue as well. Others would be certainly advancing the local, digital, and agricultural platforms for both host communities and refugees, and to regulate the informal working sectors, because most of the refugees are going into that place. I will stop here. I have other ideas to add to priority, but this is to kick off the discussion.
Sure. Let's go to Hassan now. I want to get you in the conversation, talking about how refugees in Turkey can be part of the solution, part of the recovery process, how partners, international donors can engage refugees directly in this process. And then I want to get Claudia in the mix as well, and get you to talk a little bit about the EU. So what just know, Claudia, I'm coming to you next to think about how the EU plays a role also in this process going forward, and the broader international community. Hassan.
Yes. The refugees could play the main role in reviving the economic situation if we build the skills and capacities. In my point of view, we have to encourage social inclusion and integration, but not only through language courses. The COVID-19 has made social inclusion for refugees more difficult, and sometimes, unfortunately, refugees became a target of a blame for the bad economic situation. I know language is most important and still the biggest challenge for Syrian refugees in Turkey when we talk about accessing the labor market, but it's at the same time not enough, because first of all, we need to tailor language classes and to be better designed to respond to the needs of refugees and labor market. The second one, we have to work with host government to conduct some awareness session to explain the positive existing of refugees on the economy. Because sometimes some Turkish people consider Syrian refugees are causing of unemployment because they are working for lower wages and lower salaries. And this is very important maybe to conduct awareness sessions about this point, because sometimes it played a main role to increase tension between host community and refugees. Also, maybe we can think about how we can do it or encourage establishing a joint business or activities are managed by Turkish and Syrian citizens. This could play a role in social integration. And when we talk about capacity building, yes, capacity building courses have conducted, but at the same time, when we see the ability to connect some participants to job opportunities after capacity building has become low. Often vocational training, unfortunately, has become a goal in itself rather than an instrument to support employability and access to the labor market. Also, maybe sometimes as donors and INGO, it's good during the COVID to work to provide flexible financial support to strengthen the economic resilience of host countries and ensuring refugees inclusion, because as I mentioned, most Syrian SMEs have spent their saving to cover operational costs during the COVID. Also, some donors and INGO, yes, they do it, raising awareness on the importance of legal and formal work, but at the same time, without supporting the work permit application, especially in COVID, it could be useless. Last but not the least, I encourage, as usual, to make the most of funding for livelihood projects to create more and better job opportunities for refugees and host communities. But it's very important previously to assess labor market needs and support new and existing business. Over from me, Andrew, if you have any question, I'm ready for that. Yes.
Thank you, Hassan. That's great. We're starting to get questions coming in. They're great. I want to encourage you, everyone who's participating, to keep asking questions either through the Q&A function or through the chat function. We will get to those in a minute, but I do want to do one more round, and I'm going to ask the panelists to be brief in their responses on this, but it's an important question. So if you can give us both a complete answer and do it quickly. I know that's unfair to ask, but it's important, which is, what have we learned in the past 10 years that should take us from the Syrian refugee response, that we should adjust going forward? What have we learned that we should, as we look to, let's hope it's not the next 10 years, but in reality, we know many refugees stay, right? I mean, many of the conditions may or may not be such people can return. So at least in the coming years, what could be different? What could be new? What have we learned that we should be modeling something and adjusting our patterns slightly differently? I'm gonna go to all the panelists. If you can do a 2 or 3 minute response, that would be great. Let's start on this with Sally.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, it's an interesting question. It's an important question, but from a Lebanon perspective, it's also a hard question to answer. Specifically, the reason why I say this is because we're in free fall. The country's in free fall right now, and we're seeing the humanitarian situation deteriorate dramatically for Syrian refugees, but as I said again, also for the host communities. And I think, if we want to learn from the past, we also want to anticipate what the future looks like and what sort of international support for Lebanon and Syrian refugees in Lebanon looks like. It's very hard to prioritize what the needs are today, because the gaps are so incredibly huge with such severe unfolding crises within the health sector or the economy or livelihood or the protection of refugees. Food security right now is quite concerning with potentially the lifting of the subsidies at the end of the month. Cash assistance programs are not sufficient to cover this, the most severely vulnerable Syrian refugees. And anxieties are a long time high. And so it's difficult to anticipate what the future looks like when the situation is so fluid. With that said, I mean, there are a few things that, we can touch upon. One important point is that in Lebanon specifically, we need a partner. We need a functional government, a functional political system, and one that is transparent and accountable and makes decisions, and can help the country to start to recover from all of these extreme crises. And I think it's important when it comes to what we've learned from the last 10 years that we do need a government counterpart. We need a government partner, but this needs to be one that is truly representative. And so far in Lebanon, sadly, this has not been the case. I mean, it's been over 7 months since the last government resigned in the Beirut blast, and given the situation, we still see no end in sight on when there will be some political will moving forward. Yet one thing for sure, and that what we can learn from, just to try and end on a little bit more of a positive point here, is that I think the multi-purpose cash assistance program to Syrian refugees in Lebanon is something that has shown to be taking cash to scale, and really use some innovative approaches, and one that can also help, as Lebanon is looking forward to how to address its own social protection needs and develop a comprehensive social protection framework, hopefully one that responds to all communities in the country. Then it is important that one thing we can learn is 10 years on is what can the government of Lebanon learn from such an extensive cash assistance program to Syrian refugees, and how can the learning from that be adapted to, for example, a comprehensive Lebanese social protection system. Over.
Thank you. I appreciate that. A hard road forward, a few positive lessons, but also a real need for a partner and a real need. I mean, this is a problem that goes beyond the refugee situation. I mean, there's a larger systemic issue that this is immersed in, obviously. Zaid, if I could turn to you next.
You don't expect my answers to be in 2 to 3 minutes,
Professor.
Political scientists never stop. But no, look, what we need to do, first of all, I think, any response plan, the future Jordan's response plan, which is the Ministry of Planning begun updating now, should be fully funded. Since the 2019-2021 was 65% deficit, which means 1,468 million never actually arrived to Jordan to help the Syrians or to help in the response. So this is the lesson learned: pay the money so people can, the governments and the NGOs and other sectors can do what they have to do. Without getting into details, I'll propose scenarios as propose new business models on how we can respond in Jordan to this crisis, and that helps, I hope, decision makers and donors at the same time. The first one is to capitalize on the existing initiative with the EU partners. However, more capacity building for the candidate business factories are highly recommended to qualify them for exports compliant with the incentive schemes. In July 2016, for example, the EU and Jordan agreed to simplify the rules of origin that Jordanian exporters use in their trade with the EU. Both sides reviewed and approved this initiative in December 2018. The initiative is part of EU's support for Jordan in the ongoing Syrian refugees crisis and intends to make it easier for Jordan to export to the EU, encourage investments, and create jobs both for Jordanians and for Syrians. This initiative is valid until 21st December 2030, and covers a range of manufactured products. So for exporters to be able to use this alternative rules of origin, production must involve a minimum of 15% of Syrian refugees' labor in the production facilities. So this is a huge thing that we really need to rethink and prioritize in terms of training. Scenario 2 could be using cash-based assistance and matching local business needs with refugee skills, so that earned income channels back into local markets use cash assistance as collaterals for financing refugees like the SMEs and others. And the scenario 3 would be the energy provision. As most can develop off-grid solar energy solutions for refugees, there are opportunities to use aid to build a market for these solutions by supporting consumer financing models, or helping integrate refugees as distributors or manufacturers of these energy solutions. We also need to promote the SME development amongst refugees' credit accessibility to finance, so we can improve back them. We can improve their work and back any guaranteed by international donors countries. And then probably we need, in this scenario, to allocate for new SME cash support programs, either grants or equity, as a collateral for financing. The third one would be food security, and I think Sally mentioned that when it comes to Lebanon. Again, Jordan, to identify or allocate lots of desert lands for agriculture to be utilized by Jordanian and Syrians. Agriculture cooperative concept could be applied and formed in a manner to achieve this goal. Women empowerment approach is absolutely at the center of this. So that's what I can think of for future.
Great, thank you. I appreciate it, Professor, and that was both insightful and concise, actually. As a fellow political scientist, and Hassan, I want to give you the last word before we go to my colleague Camille, and then we're going to open up to the questions that have been coming through. But Hassan, 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, briefly, what have we learned that we could do better going forward?
Yes, actually, I will talk not only on Turkey level, in general, in Syrian response. Actually, the first one, localization, how we can activate this acronym, not to be only terminology or acronym. Today, if you ask me, do we see in general INGOs is making a humanitarian action as local as possible, as international as necessary? Actually, when we go to practical level, unfortunately, the situation not like that. The second one, sustainable and impact projects. Okay, this is we have to start in the first day. Even so, when we talk about relief and the humanitarian response, we have to think how we can secure sustainable and impact projects, because as you see, the most of countries today, they cut some of fund as a result of COVID-19, because it's a global issue, and in general in conflict locations, what we have to do it. This is very important, and we have to work on Nexus cycle as a humanitarian development and peace building. Also in the first day, I know maybe in Syrian response, till now, the most of donors, they still deal with Syrian crisis only as a humanitarian and relief response, but the situation when you go to inside Syria, not like that. And the last one, avoid the duplications of efforts. Unfortunately, till now, we see overlapping in some response in health, wash, and education, and all of these sectors. That's from my side. Over from me.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Hassan. Thank you. This was a fabulous panel. I want to thank all the panelists for their insights. Don't go away, because we have questions for you that are coming to you in a minute. But I want to turn it over to Camille Lacoste, my wonderful colleague from MPI and MPI Europe, who was the lead author and the coordinator in preparing the report. Tell us what's in the report. I mean, you were looking at experiences around the world of incorporating refugee and forced migrant populations, and what that might inform in terms of the Syrian crisis and in terms of Syrian displacement. What did you find out? Tell us a little bit about this report. And let's, Lisa, if we can go ahead and put the link to the report up again as well, so people have it front and center. Camille.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you to all the panelists for the interesting discussion. I'll try to be brief to leave some time for question. But I'll go back a bit on the process in some of the case studies, best practices, good practices that we try to highlight in this report. So our starting point, conversation with DSP now about a year ago, with the acknowledgement of the many pressing needs faced by Syrian refugees, but also host communities in the past 10 years. But also the acknowledgement that there's been many new developments in the field of development, humanitarian actors that have happened in the region, and that in a way the Syrian crisis has catalyzed. And so from the MPI side, building on our work in various other contexts, we were well aware that many of these innovations have also happened in other regions, with protracted refugee crisis in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, where our team has done a lot of work, in Europe, in Asia, or even in Australia. And so we started with an assessment of the most pressing needs in the Syrian context. These areas that have not seen much progress in recent years due to lack of political will, lack of funding, or simply the absence of technical solution to these issues. And here we look for examples of policy of programs in countries and communities that had faced similar challenges and had tried to address them, and what could be learned from this mechanism. And so in the past year, we've collected data from nearly 20 programs and policy framework across 16 countries, and organizers thinking across five main thematic areas. So protection, social protection, education, livelihood, and healthcare. And healthcare, as you know, is now a top concern in the context of the pandemic. This is something that we've all been thinking about in the past months. Barriers to access to healthcare has been even more concerning for refugees. And here, for example, we look at the example of a program in Costa Rica where the government has been working with UNHCR and managed to extend access to public health services to the refugees population, and is now working toward making this gain durable. Another area we looked at, and I think Hassan mentioned it, was access to livelihood. We all know this has been a main hurdle for Syrian refugees, especially during this crisis with the lockdown, especially in Lebanon, with the economic crisis, as Sally mentioned. And here we looked, for example, at how a country like Ethiopia has fulfilled its promise to enhance refugee access to the labor market. And more specifically, what were the implications of this promise? What it means that you need, for instance, to give refugee access, like freedom, you need to grant them freedom of movement. You need a system of procedures to grant them work permits. But what we've also looked at, and I think this is also important in the context of the Jordan discussion that Zaid mentioned, is how development actors need to deliver on their own promise to help Ethiopia maintain this momentum and this promise on delivering work permit for refugees. We've also studied how in Latin America, the migration unit at the Inter-American Development Bank is working towards building more resilient economies in the region, and also how civil society actors like Migraflix in Brazil are supporting refugee entrepreneurs with activity closely tailored to the needs of refugee and the constraint that they face, but also trying to change the narrative on refugees and how they can contribute to the all societies. And finally, I'll end with a few words on protection, because this is one of the main gaps faced by Syrian refugees and refugee more broadly in the Middle East region. We research, what have been some of the innovations, some of the policy changes on protection issue. How Peru, for instance, has rolled out this temporary state permit for Venezuelan migrants and refugees since 2017. What have been the benefits and the limitation of this mechanism, and how it can pave the way for, toward more permanent solution for refugees and migrants. We've also analyzed how a country like Colombia develop policies and systems to prevent statelessness, which is also, an issue in the region. How Colombia, set up this measure with few document requirement, free of cost, and that was rolled out in quite a sensitive political environment, which is something that I think we've all discussed today. And finally, we were reminded how, to look into some of the more operational challenges and administrative burdens, and how they could be overcome, looking, for instance, at this one-stop shop experiment in Ethiopia. So now, to conclude, all of these efforts come with difficulties. It implies to manage public opinion, to include refugees in already quite complex policy frameworks. And while this policy can be inclusive on paper, enforcing them is never straightforward. It takes continued political leadership, engagement between different ministries that don't always talk to each other to begin with, and the constant effort of civil society actors, including to monitor what's being achieved. And that's also, and I think this is the context of today's discussion, as we're heading toward the donor conference. Many of our case studies show that the success, the acceptability, the sustainability of many of these inclusive policies and programs very much depend on the continuous support of international donors, which is particularly needed now, even though we're seeing some states, exited this crisis in some part of the world. What our reports say, what we're very well aware of is each policy, each program is very much context specific, but I think we still capture some of the common trends and tools that are needed to support pathway to durable solution for refugees, either to promote new instruments, but also to pave the way for structural changes. And maybe one last word I'd like to conclude with these ideas that I think we've been working with, is the fact that there needs to be adequate policy frameworks to allow for many of these international projects to fully reach their objectives. And I think, in the light of the donor conference, this is something that needs to be part of this conversation. They're very sensitive issues, but that's often a condition for the success of this international intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. I mean, this is, I highly commend the report to you, and congratulations, Camille. I know that was an enormous amount of work, and thank you, DSP. This was really a real partnership and a great partnership of sharing ideas back and forth. Lana, Stade, and Catherine, of course, I mean, really spent a lot of time with you on this and with people in your network. I mean, getting feedback on what would be meaningful for organizations in the region from the broader global experience, and what wasn't as relevant as well. But hopefully some of these things will prove useful that are being done around the world. And just as matter of conversation, it's something I think we lack a lot of overall. I spend a lot of time on the other large displacement flow, which is Venezuelans in Latin America. And for us, I have to say, the other ways being part of this project on the periphery is also learning what we can take back on the other side of the ocean, right? I mean, it is incredibly important to have this back and forth, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle East to Latin America to Europe. I mean, we often operate in silos, and injecting these new ideas in are really useful sometimes in having aha moments that help push us beyond our usual assumptions about what's possible. So with that, there are a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them. We have about 15 minutes left. I'm going to leave Catherine a couple minutes to close our session. So I'm going to read a series of questions. Hopefully the panelists have had a chance to look at the Q&A in the chat section, so they've already thought about some of these questions, but I'm going to read my abbreviated version of them to you. And then I'm going to go back to each panelist, and you can answer quickly whichever of the ones you want. So let me, there is a set of questions. Marta asks about local schools and how they're part of the solution and how they can be, what else can be done. There is a question, I missed the name on it, from how Syrian children have been affected by a year out of school with the lockdown, and what effect that's going to have on the long term. There's also a question from someone about how are NGOs and INGOs operating in times of COVID-19, what has had to be scaled down, and if it's affected the financing of projects in the region. There's a question about resettlement, and is resettlement increasing? We see the US government re-engaging on refugee programs. It has not happened yet, I should say, but a commitment that starting in October, there'll be a significant increase, and perhaps the rest of this year as well. And are other countries following suit? What effect does that have on Syrian displacement, Syrian refugees? There's a question from my friend David Smolensky, about what can Venezuelans, who is from Venezuela himself and works for the United American States, what should people in Latin America learn from the region about displacement and what they can do in Latin America? There is a question specifically for Professor Zaid on the JRP and whether there's been any evaluation that it has been well funded. What has been done in terms of evaluating outcomes. And there's a question on, which is a good overarching one, on how to engage refugees themselves, not merely as recipients, but in designing and carrying out the response to the refugee crisis. So with that, let me turn it back to all of you. And in fact, Hassan, you might want to start with that last one, in addition to anything else you want to respond to from the remaining questions. So Hassan, let me go to you, and then we'll go to Sally, and we'll go through all the panelists here.
Yes, actually, when we talk about local schools, maybe the case in Turkey is good, because actually refugees students in general is integrated well in the Turkish education system. But at the same time, when we talk about COVID and how we will see the situation after the vaccination will start, also when we talk about health centers, actually they vaccinate all people, host communities and refugees, without doing any discrimination in this point. How we see the situation during the next period? Maybe it could be better because, as you know, today lockdown in Turkey is less than previous, and the economic cycle is working again. But at the same time, we have to take some lessons learned from this period and how we can make more integration for refugees if like this COVID happened again. Because as I mentioned, yes, the host community suffered from unemployment and all of this, but unfortunately the percentage in the refugees level was higher as a percentage.
Thank you, Hassan. Sally.
Thank you. So I'll touch upon a few questions. I'll respond to just a few of them quickly, if I may. So on the part on sort of the impact of Syrian children now being a year out of school, and so I mean, Oxfam is not an education actor, but just, you know, it's important to note, because this comes out in our various protection monitoring, that even before the pandemic, Syrian children were still having trouble accessing schools in Lebanon. And there were a number of reasons for this, basically the cost of living, the cost of sort of the freedom of movement, especially given that there's, you know, around 80% of Syrian refugees don't have legal residency, and you know, the access to livelihoods, which is becoming more and more scarce in an economic situation. So we're seeing a lot more, you know, school dropouts and kids having, you know, forced to work, and a myriad of other reasons. So and for Syrian refugees, so it's beyond just this past year. We've seen, sadly, a decline in accessing school for, you know, even that predate the pandemic, and also given the current situation in the country with a lot of road closures since October 17th and the October 17th revolution in Lebanon. On how we operate as INGOs in the pandemic, I mean, we have definitely scaled down a lot of our, you know, operations, sadly, because of the various lockdowns in the country that we've had to endure. But we've always prioritized life-saving activities, so that never stopped. And although in Lebanon, for example, we had faced a lot of challenges with this, so the government had, you know, at several points in time in the lockdown imposed restrictions on organizations to access the field and access ITSs and to operate, and what is the definition of a humanitarian sort of, you know, activity and response. But we lobbied very hard, and you know, collectively as organizations and with the UN and to donors, the government, to ensure that access to the most vulnerable communities and essential life-saving activities such as around water, sanitation, and health, especially in a pandemic, continue. The point on quickly on resettlement, you know, I mean, we all know very well that we are, you know, we're not even close to sharing the burden equally as a global community when it comes to this refugee response. And you know, it's good to see, you know, the US, you know, start to pick up on this, but I mean, there's a lot more work and, you know, serious the inequality when it comes to sharing the burden equally among states. And for refugees in Lebanon, I mean, when it comes to the 3 durable solutions, integration is not an option, although, you know, we're operating, doing everything we can to, you know, work to make their stay as dignified as possible, which is becoming even more challenging in this context. Resettlement options are extremely limited, and Syria is still not safe to return, yet refugees are stuck between, you know, in a catch-22 where they're being pushed by, you know, government policies to return, and also the context itself is pushing them to return. So that's very worrying. And just one more point, and I can stop on. I saw a question that you didn't mention, Andrew, but around Palestinian refugees. And it's important to also not forget the presence of 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Palestinian refugees from Syria as well, who sometimes yes, we do forget them, sadly, and we do need to do better here, and specifically when it comes to the funding situation that has been it's impacting the entire response, but specifically for Palestinian refugees, the impact is far greater as well. So thank you. Over.
Thank you, Sally. We are 3 minutes from ending. We may go over a minute or two here, but Professor Zaid, if you want to give a quick 2-minute response, and then we'll go to Claudia.
I'm a lucky person. When it comes to time, comes to me. Well, I will react to two things about the evaluation of the assessments of the Jordan response plan. I mean, once you know that 65% of the fund is not there, and imagining the very efficiency of Jordan government so dealing with the funds, then you can simply calculate the outcomes. I'm being very ironic and cynical, which means bad, except for some access to education. And recently, the Ministry of Health just, included the Syrian refugees for vaccination and healthcare at the same rate for non-secured Jordanians. But I wanted to talk back again about the issue of the mindset and the bigger picture. And I'm delighted that Sally just touched upon that, not only about the Palestinian refugees, and when you talk about the Palestinian refugees, then we'll come to Jordan. When it comes to talking about Syrian refugees, then we'll come to Jordan again and what to do about it. See, the focus, first, the dividing mechanisms by donors and the competing projects in the market when it comes to the refugees and hosting communities and refugees communities, it's just distracting. It's just losing focus. And, we end up having NGOs and intellectuals and institutions competing for funded-driven kind of projects. I'm not really sure are they contributing to solving the problem or just to making it permanent. So the issue is of integrating refugees within host communities and never about rebuilding Syria and the safe return of the refugees to Syria itself, which is, to my mind, the issue that we just decided to neglect. The question would be for what reasons and whose interest we are doing that. And yes, Syria is not a safe place yet for a return, but this shouldn't be the major issue of focus of our efforts. Of course, well, it's simple. Well, anyone will say, how about these people are suffering, waiting for the Syria to be safe for people to come back? I'm not saying, focus on one and forgetting the others, but what seems to be forgotten now is that this is very important issues is either the safe return to a safe, stable Syria or to a settlement to a third safe place, which both are out of the equation at this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And a virtual clap for everyone here for your time, your insights, your honesty, as we talk about a really difficult situation for which there's not always solutions, but yes, there are strategies and opportunities going forward. And I think you've all underlined where some of those lie. Thank you. I apologize for the questions we didn't get answered. I know there are many more. And hopefully we'll have future occasions to continue the conversation. The audio will be available on the event website as of tomorrow, Thursday. And you have the link to the report already in the chat. And let me turn it over on behalf of MPI. Thank you for this opportunity to spend the last hour and 15 minutes with you, the opportunity to work with DSP, the opportunity to be with our panelists. Thank you again. And let me turn over to Catherine for final remarks.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, really just to echo thanks to all of the panelists and the participants. I think it's been a slightly overwhelming conversation. I think it just shows the scale of the challenge that we still need to confront and the ambition that we need to have going into Brussels. So I really hope that this conversation can inform the day of dialogue and the ministerial conversations that we'll be seeing, and that we'll see some generous commitment to support colleagues. I also think it's often easy to feel a bit hopeless in the scale of a lot of our challenge, and the report that MPI and DSP produced, I think, think is really to show that there is a lot of grappling with many similar issues across the world, and a huge amount of learning that we can draw from that as we rethink our strategies. And so I really want to encourage people to take a look and to reach out to follow up on that, and to thank the European Regional Development and Protection Programme for their really generous funding to DSP that made this research possible. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, we're looking forward to continuing to engage in the lead up to Brussels and on these issues moving forward. So thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.